On Thursday, President Trump sat down with Axios reporter Barack Ravid and said something that changed the entire tone of this war in a single sentence. He said, "I'm considering a massive attack. Bigger than ever before. I'm close to making a decision. We are all set for it." Then he added a line that's honestly harder to sit with than the threat itself. He said Iran hasn't received enough pain yet. That's not a warning buried in a press release. That's the President of the United States on the record, telling a national outlet that the biggest strike of this entire war is sitting ready to go, and that the only thing left is his own decision to launch it. This didn't come out of nowhere, and it isn't happening in isolation either. It landed in the same 48-hour window as a rejected ceasefire proposal, a brand new maritime blockade threat in the Red Sea, a formal warning from an international human rights organization about potential war crimes, and oil prices crossing a threshold they haven't hit since May. Any one of those on its own would be a significant story worth an entire video by itself. All of them landing together in the same 2 days is what actually makes this moment worth stopping and understanding properly. If this kind of sourced, no-spin breakdown is useful to you, subscribing genuinely helps more of it reach you when it matters. So let's slow down and go through exactly what's been confirmed here, step by step, because this is one of the most consequential moments of the entire conflict so far, and it deserves more than a 30-second headline treatment. Let's set the scene first with the numbers that frame everything else in this story. According to NPR's July 24th coverage, this comment came as the U.S. military completed its 13th consecutive night of strikes against Iran, specifically aimed at degrading Tehran's ability to threaten maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. 13 nights. Not a single pause since this specific round of the war reignited, and not a single official signal from Washington suggesting that streak is about to break on its own without either a strike or a deal forcing the issue. To put that in perspective, this current stretch began after the original June 17th Memorandum of Understanding collapsed in early July, meaning in roughly 2.5 weeks since that collapse, there hasn't been a single night without American strikes hitting Iranian territory, a pace that shows no sign of easing regardless of what Washington ultimately decides about a strike bigger than anything seen so far. And Trump's Axios comment landed right in the middle of that stretch. Not as some isolated outburst, but as the loudest public signal yet that Washington believes the current pace of nightly strikes hasn't been enough to force Iran back to the table, a shift in tone that outside observers had been watching for since the 13th night was first confirmed. So what exactly would a massive attack, bigger than ever before, actually look like? According to reporting from Anti-War. Com's news desk, Trump didn't fully elaborate when he made the comment to Axios, but he has previously threatened to launch massive strikes specifically targeting civilian infrastructure inside Iran, including bridges, power plants, and water desalination plants. That's not speculation about his intentions. That's a direct extension of a threat he'd already made publicly, and specifically just 1 day earlier. Anti-war. Com's reporting also noted this threat came amid growing signs that the U.S. was preparing to escalate after 12 consecutive nights of airstrikes at the time, with Trump specifically telling Axios, "We are all set for it," language suggesting the operational planning, whatever it involves, is already in an advanced enough state that the only remaining step is his own final authorization. Water desalination plants deserve a second of attention on their own because they're a category of target that hasn't come up much in the war until this point. Iran, like much of the Gulf region, depends heavily on desalination to supply fresh water to major population centers, meaning a strike on that kind of infrastructure would have consequences reaching civilians far more directly and far more immediately than a strike on a military command center or a missile storage site, since the loss of clean drinking water for a major city affects everyone within days, rather than only those connected to the military or industrial systems a more conventional strike might target. Naming water desalination plants specifically, alongside bridges and power plants, as potential targets is exactly the kind of detail that explains why Human Rights Watch felt the need to issue a formal statement now, rather than at any earlier point in this 5-month war. According to Human Rights Watch's own statement, dated July 24th, Trump said on July 23rd, quote, "From this point forward, any time the Islamic Republic of Iran shoots at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, whether it be by missile, rocket, drone, or any other device or weapon, the United States will bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant, including those located next to or in the capital city of Tehran." Read that again. Not a military target, a bridge or a power plant, explicitly including ones inside the capital itself, tied directly to Iran's own shipping attacks as a one-for-one trade. Iran didn't stay quiet about that threat. According to that same Human Rights Watch statement, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament, posted directly on social media on July 22nd that if Iran's security isn't ensured, No infrastructure will be safe. A direct counter-threat matching Trump's own language almost word for word. Human Rights Watch's own assessment of this exchange is worth hearing in full, because it's coming from an organization whose entire job is tracking violations of the laws of war, not from either side of this conflict. The organization said plainly that U.S. and Iranian leaders are now threatening deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure, following earlier fighting in which forces on both sides had already unlawfully struck civilians and civilian objects in Iran, Gulf countries, and Israel. Human Rights Watch went further, calling on other countries to make clear to both Washington and Tehran that anyone responsible for war crimes would be brought to justice, including through universal jurisdiction. That's about as serious a warning as an international watchdog organization issues, aimed squarely and equally at both governments involved. It's worth being precise about what makes that warning so significant. Under the laws of armed conflict, deliberately targeting infrastructure whose primary purpose serves civilians rather than a distinct military function is generally treated as unlawful, regardless of which side does it or what provocation is cited as the justification. A bridge that happens to carry both civilian traffic and occasional military vehicles, or a power plant that primarily supplies homes and hospitals rather than a military base, sits in exactly the kind of gray area international law was written to protect, precisely because wartime pressure tends to push both sides toward justifying strikes on exactly that kind of target. Human Rights Watch, naming both Washington and Tehran in the same statement rather than singling out one side, is itself a signal of how symmetrically this specific threat has escalated over just the past 2 days, and it puts both governments on formal notice, in writing, from an organization with decades of credibility documenting exactly this kind of violation in other conflicts around the world. If you're finding this kind of layered, sourced context useful instead of just the headline, genuinely helps this reach more people looking for that. Now let's talk about why Trump feels the need to escalate at all, because that part matters just as much as the threat itself, and it connects directly to a diplomatic failure that happened in the same window as his Axios comments. It's worth understanding just how unusual it is for a sitting president to use language this blunt about an active military decision, still pending his own sign-off. Presidents typically let military spokespeople or defense officials characterize pending operations in vague procedural terms. Options remain on the table. All contingencies are being reviewed. Trump instead went directly to a reporter and described the scale of a potential strike in explicitly comparative terms, bigger than ever before, while confirming the operational readiness himself. We are all set for it. That's a deliberate choice to put his own name and his own specific words behind the threat, rather than letting it filter through official channels. And it's exactly the kind of public commitment that makes walking the threat back politically costly if it doesn't eventually happen. According to Times July 24th reporting, Trump's comments came right after Iran reportedly rejected a 15-point ceasefire proposal from the United States, one that had been delivered through Iraq as an intermediary just the day before. That's a specific, substantial diplomatic offer, not a vague overture, and its rejection is a big part of what's driving the sharper tone out of Washington this week. Trump told Axios that Iran is, in his words, not ready to make a deal, and that its leaders have some evil intentions. Language that goes noticeably further than the more measured diplomatic vocabulary his administration had generally used earlier in the war when describing Tehran's leadership. That same Time reporting noted the core sticking point hasn't actually changed much since this war reignited. It's still the Strait of Hormuz. The original Memorandum of Understanding signed back on June 17th never definitively resolved who controls passage through that waterway, instead punting the question to separate talks between Oman and Iran. And Iran has continued asserting its own right to manage passage through the strait, including potentially charging fees on vessels moving through it. So this isn't a new argument. It's the exact same unresolved dispute that's been sitting underneath this entire war. And Trump's newest threat is essentially an attempt to force a resolution through overwhelming pressure rather than continued negotiation. A shift from diplomatic patience to direct coercion that's been building gradually over the entire 5 months of this conflict, rather than appearing suddenly this week. It's worth asking why a 15-point proposal, presumably covering a wide range of issues beyond just Hormuz, would collapse entirely rather than being partially accepted or countered. Neither Times reporting nor any of the other outlets covering this rejection detailed exactly which of the 15 points Iran objected to most strongly, which itself tells you something. The rejection appears to have been delivered as a blanket no rather than a negotiating counteroffer, the kind of response that tends to precede further escalation rather than a return to the table. That's consistent with everything else that followed within the same 48 hours. Trump's massive attack comment, the bridge and power plant threat, and Galibaf's matching counter threat all landed in the direct aftermath of that rejection, not before it. which suggests Washington read the blanket rejection itself as confirmation that softer pressure had already run its course. There's also a financial dimension to this dispute that's just as sharp as the military one. According to that same Time reporting, Trump threatened on Thursday to use frozen Iranian funds, assets currently held under U.S. sanctions control that were supposed to be released to Iran as part of the June Memorandum of Understanding, to pay for damages to any ships hit during this conflict. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi responded directly, saying that seizing another nation's assets to pay for unrelated future claims sets what he called an incendiary precedent. That specific word choice, incendiary, is notable coming from Iran's own top diplomat, someone whose job is generally to de-escalate rather than inflame, which suggests Tehran views this financial threat as being taken just as seriously internally as the military one. So, on top of the military escalation, there's now a live financial dispute over billions of dollars that were supposed to be part of the actual peace deal, being repurposed by Washington as leverage in the middle of renewed fighting, adding an entirely separate axis of confrontation layered on top of the strikes themselves. Let's talk about how Iran has actually been responding on the ground, because this hasn't just been rhetoric on either side. According to NPR's coverage, Iran's army said on July 24th that it carried out drone strikes against several American military facilities and bases in Bahrain and Jordan, in direct retaliation for the latest round of U.S. attacks. Photographs distributed by AFP that same day showed Iranians riding past a public display of Iranian-made Zulfikar missiles at Azadi Square in Tehran, a visible, deliberate show of continued military capability at the exact moment Washington is threatening its biggest strike yet. Separately, according to KPBS Public Media's reporting, security forces in the Kurdistan region of Iraq shot down explosive-laden drones near Erbil's International Airport, which hosts U.S.-led coalition troops, forcing the airport to briefly close before reopening normally later that same morning. An AFP journalist on the ground reported hearing several blasts and seeing air defenses activate near the airport during that same incident. So this fight is no longer contained to Iranian and American territory directly. It's now regularly spilling into Bahrain, Jordan, and Iraq's Kurdistan region, with real infrastructure, in this case, a functioning international airport, serving both civilian and coalition military traffic, getting caught in the middle. And there's an entirely new front that opened up just this week, one that's arguably just as dangerous as anything happening directly between Washington and Tehran. According to Bloomberg's reporting, the Houthi movement in Yemen, which is backed by Iran, declared a maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia on Monday, threatening to cut off the kingdom's oil exports through both the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. CNBC's coverage confirmed the Houthis had already claimed strikes on Saudi oil tankers this week, opening what that reporting called a genuinely new front in this conflict. That same KPBS public media reporting noted Trump had separately threatened major military punishment against the Houthis, specifically if their attacks continue, adding that Saudi Arabia backs an internationally recognized Yemeni government controlling the northern part of the country, while the Houthis have blamed Saudi Arabia directly for a strike on the airport in Yemen's capital just the week before. That specific grievance matters, because it means the Houthis aren't simply acting as an extension of Iran's own dispute with Washington. They're also pursuing what they present as their own separate retaliation against Saudi Arabia, layering a distinct regional conflict directly on top of the broader Iran confrontation. Trump responded to that specific threat in a Truth Social post on Thursday, warning of what he called major military punishment against both Iran and the Houthis directly if commercial ships continue to be targeted. Think about what that actually means strategically. The Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait are two of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet, sitting at opposite ends of the Arabian Peninsula. One is already under a partial American blockade and repeated Iranian attacks. The other, the Bab el-Mandeb, now has a second separate threat hanging over it from an Iranian-backed force specifically targeting Saudi Arabia's own exports. If both choke points become genuinely unreliable for commercial shipping at the same time, you're not looking at a regional disruption anymore. You're looking at a simultaneous squeeze on two of the primary arteries connecting Gulf energy production to the rest of the world, which is exactly the kind of scenario that tends to move oil markets even faster than either threat would on its own. And it's precisely the kind of compounding risk that makes this particular week feel qualitatively different from earlier stretches of this same 5-month war. So at the exact moment Trump is threatening the biggest strike of the war against Iran itself, a second connected front is opening up against Iran's own proxy force, threatening an entirely different and equally critical stretch of global shipping. Let's talk about what all of this is doing to the global economy, because it's not an abstract consequence. It's already showing up in real numbers. According to Bloomberg's reporting, Brent crude oil prices have already topped $100 a barrel, the first time crossing that threshold since May, and are on track for a weekly gain of roughly 10% as this conflict continues to simmer. military. Comms coverage confirmed U.S. retail gasoline prices have climbed above $4 a gallon as a direct consequence of the disruption. And Bloomberg's reporting specifically noted that before this war, the Strait of Hormuz carried about 1/5 of the entire world's energy supply, a figure worth sitting with given that traffic through that same strait has now slowed to what that reporting described as a trickle. It's worth putting that 10% weekly gain in a bit more context, because oil markets don't typically move that fast without a genuinely significant shift in perceived risk. A 10% move in a single week reflects traders actively pricing in the real possibility of further disruption, not just reacting to strikes that have already happened. In other words, the market itself is behaving as though Trump's massive attack threat and the new Houthi blockade declaration are credible enough to plan around financially right now, before either one has actually been carried out. That's a meaningful signal in its own right, independent of anything either government has officially confirmed. So Trump's threatened massive attack isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening at the exact moment global energy markets are already absorbing serious, measurable strain from 13 straight nights of war, with real consequences already showing up at gas pumps well beyond the Middle East itself. Here's where it gets genuinely complicated, though, because at the very same moment Trump is threatening the biggest strike of the war, there are real, separate signs that a diplomatic off-ramp might still be possible. According to CNBC's July 24th reporting, Pakistan is actively looking for ways to restart the stalled peace talks between the U.S. and Iran, according to 3 separate Pakistani sources cited by Reuters. That same CNBC reporting noted that stocks actually rose and oil prices fell specifically after that report came out, as investors read it as new hope that both sides might still find an off-ramp before things escalate any further. So you have 2 genuinely contradictory signals landing within about 24 hours of each other, Trump publicly threatening the largest attack of the entire war, and Pakistan quietly working the phones to try to bring both sides back to a negotiating table. Markets, at least in that moment, chose to believe the diplomatic signal over the military one. Pakistan's involvement here isn't a new development either. It's a continuation of a role Islamabad has played throughout this entire war. Pakistan organized the original ceasefire back on April 8th, and separately delivered this week's rejected 15-point proposal to Iran through its own diplomatic channels via Iraq. That makes Pakistan the one consistent thread running through nearly every attempted off-ramp in this conflict, from the original truce to the collapsed June Memorandum of Understanding to this week's rejected proposal to whatever comes next. The fact that Islamabad is reportedly already working to restart talks again within days of the last proposal falling apart suggests Pakistan itself doesn't view this week's rejection as a permanently closed door, even if Washington's public rhetoric in the same window has moved sharply in the opposite direction, a genuinely striking contrast between a mediator still betting on diplomacy and a president publicly describing the outlines of his biggest possible strike of the war. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's own language this week captured that same tension. According to CNBC's reporting, speaking to reporters on Thursday, Rubio described Trump's entire approach to this war as, in his words, a head for an eye. He said plainly, honestly, that's what it's going to be. They will pay a very heavy price for the things they're doing. They're already paying a very heavy price. That's about as clear a statement as you'll get from America's top diplomat, that the current strategy isn't measured deterrence, it's meant to be disproportionate punishment, explicitly framed that way by the man usually responsible for keeping a door open to negotiation. It's worth noting how far that specific phrase moves from traditional diplomatic language. But an eye for an eye implies proportional response. A head for an eye explicitly does not, and Rubio chose that specific escalation of the phrase deliberately in an on-the-record comment to reporters, not in a private briefing where it might be walked back later, which is itself a signal that this disproportionate framing reflects the administration's actual current thinking, rather than a slip of the tongue. And Iran's own posture hasn't softened either. According to NPR's reporting, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was quoted by state media saying that Iran has shown it will not bow to U.S. bullying and will, under no circumstances, respond to the language of force, pressure, and threats. That same report noted Araghchi said he'd held what he called detailed talks with the foreign ministers of both Russia and China, a detail worth noting because it shows Tehran is actively working its own external relationships, even while publicly refusing to bend to Washington's pressure, rather than negotiating from a position of total isolation. Those conversations with Moscow and Beijing also matter, because both countries have historically provided Iran with diplomatic cover at the United Nations and alternative trade relationships that help cushion the impact of Western sanctions, meaning Araghchi's outreach isn't just symbolic. It's part of keeping Iran's broader economic and diplomatic survival options open even as its direct relationship with Washington deteriorates further by the day. And it suggests Tehran is preparing for a scenario in which this conflict continues, for a considerable stretch longer, rather than ending imminently through either capitulation or a renewed ceasefire. Let's step back into the regional picture for a second, because Britain's role in this specific week's escalation adds another layer worth understanding. According to that same CNBC reporting, the United Kingdom reiterated that it stands ready 24/7 to defend itself, after Iran had labeled the country an accomplice to the United States over its use of British military bases by American forces. That same reporting confirmed that shortly after this war originally began, the UK had given permission for the US to use its bases, a policy that's continued through this latest, sharpest phase of the conflict. That British basing arrangement isn't a minor logistical footnote either. American B-1 Lancer bombers have flown missions against Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targets directly from RAF Fairford in England after US. Warships in the region had exhausted their own cruise missile stockpiles, meaning British soil became operationally necessary for keeping this specific campaign running at its current pace, not just a symbolic show of Allied solidarity. So Britain remains squarely inside this story as well, not as a bystander, but as a named party in Iran's own public accusations, even as the headline story this week is Trump's threatened massive attack. That matters for how you should read Iran's own escalating language about infrastructure, because Ghalibaf's warning that no infrastructure will be safe wasn't necessarily limited to targets inside Iran or aimed only at American assets, given that Iran's foreign ministry has already separately and explicitly named Britain as complicit in this war through its basing decisions. So let's put the entire picture on the board and figure out what it actually means. 13 consecutive nights of American strikes have failed to bring Iran back to a stable ceasefire. Iran just rejected a 15-point proposal delivered through Iraq. Trump has now publicly floated the biggest strike of the entire war, explicitly tied to civilian infrastructure, including bridges and power plants inside the capital itself. Iran's own parliament speaker has issued a matching threat against unspecified infrastructure. Human Rights Watch has warned both governments they may be edging toward war crimes. A second front is opened in the Red Sea through Iran's Houthi allies, threatening Saudi Arabia's own oil exports. Oil has crossed $100 a barrel, moving fast enough in a single week to suggest markets are already pricing in further escalation. And in the middle of all of that, Pakistan is quietly trying to restart the exact diplomatic process that collapsed just weeks ago. That's not a simple story with one clear direction. It's a moment where the two most likely outcomes, the biggest American strike of the entire war and a genuine return to negotiations, are both sitting on the table at the same time, being actively pursued by different actors within the same 48-hour window. Trump's own language, "I'm close to making a decision," is about as direct as a head of state gets about the fact that this specific outcome hasn't been locked in yet, that it's still, as of this week, a decision rather than a done deal. What makes this moment different from earlier points in the war is the sheer number of independent actors now involved in shaping what happens next. This isn't just a two-country standoff between Washington and Tehran anymore. Britain is named directly by Iran as complicit through its basing decisions. Human Rights Watch is publicly warning both governments about potential war crimes, liability. Saudi Arabia is now facing its own separate blockade threat from Iran's Houthi allies, entirely independent of anything happening in Hormuz. Russia and China are receiving detailed briefings directly from Iran's foreign minister. And Pakistan is working behind the scenes to salvage a diplomatic process that's already collapsed and been rebuilt at least twice since this war began back in February. Every one of those actors has their own separate incentives, and any one of them could end up being the deciding factor in whether Trump's massive attack actually happens, gets scaled back, or gets replaced entirely by a renewed round of talks. Consider how differently each of those actors is incentivized. Britain has every reason to want de-escalation, given it's already been named a target by the IRGC over its own basing decisions. Saudi Arabia has every reason to want the Houthi threat neutralized quickly, given how directly it now threatens its own oil exports rather than just regional stability in the abstract. Russia and China have every reason to encourage Iran to hold firm rather than capitulate, given their own broader strategic rivalry with Washington. And Pakistan, as the one country that's repeatedly stepped into the mediator role throughout this entire war, has every reason to keep trying, given how much diplomatic credibility it's already invested in past ceasefire efforts, however short-lived they've turned out to be. None of those incentives point in the same direction, which is exactly why predicting where this goes next is so much harder than it would be in a simpler two-party conflict, and why watching all of these threads together, rather than fixating on Trump's threat alone, gives a far more complete picture of how the next week of this war is actually likely to unfold. That ambiguity is exactly why the title of this story matters. Iran will genuinely never be the same after whatever comes next, whether that's the massive attack, bigger than ever before, that Trump described to Axios, or whether Pakistan's quiet diplomatic push actually manages to pull both sides back from that edge before it happens. Either path represents a fundamentally different next chapter for a country that's now endured 13 straight nights of bombardment, a naval blockade, the loss of its own supreme leader back in February, and now the direct public threat of having its bridges and power plants, including inside its own capital, treated as fair game in a war neither side currently seems ready to formally end. And given how quickly this specific week has moved from a rejected ceasefire to a massive attack threat, to a new Red Sea blockade, to oil crossing $100 a barrel, all within about 72 hours, whichever direction this actually breaks, is likely to become clear far sooner than most people expect. Thank you for watching, and for sitting through the version of this story that actually lays out both the threat and the diplomacy happening in parallel, instead of just running with the scariest possible headline available. This is genuinely one of the fastest moving weeks of the entire war, with new statements from Trump, new retaliatory strikes from Iran, and new diplomatic movement from Pakistan all landing within hours of each other. So treat everything here as the picture as of July 24th, and expect this to keep shifting fast in the days immediately ahead, possibly even within hours of this video going live, given how quickly each of the last several days has already moved. Between now and whenever Trump actually makes his stated decision, watch for a few specific signals, whether Pakistan's renewed diplomatic push produces any public confirmation from either Washington or Tehran, whether Iran's Houthi allies actually follow through on the Red Sea blockade threat, or whether it remains rhetorical, and whether oil prices keep climbing at anything close to this week's pace, since that alone tends to shape how much political room any president has to actually order the kind of strike Trump described publicly this week. If you want the next update the moment Trump actually makes his decision one way or the other, subscribing is the best way to catch it as soon as it's confirmed, rather than piecing it together from scattered rumors and unverified social media posts. And I'd genuinely like to know which outcome you think is more likely, the massive attack Trump described, or Pakistan's push actually pulling this back from the edge. Drop that in the comments. I'll see you in the very next one.